Firefighters broke into the apartment because neighbors were concerned about not seeing the couple living here for several days. In one of the rooms, the firefighters found an elderly woman with no signs of life. The further events take us back in time. A musical performance took place at the Theatre de Champs-Élysées, after which Georges, a teacher at the conservatory, and his wife went home. The couple discovered that someone had tried to break into their apartment, but the burglars had failed, and wanted to call the police, but Georges said he would speak to the concierge about it tomorrow. During the night, Georges woke up and noticed his wife was not sleeping. In the morning during breakfast, Georges noticed that and was unresponsive to his words. She seemed distant and apparently didn't understand what was happening or where she was. Georges tried to bring her to her senses with a wet towel, but in vain. Georges was very frightened and was going to go get help, but after a few minutes, and acted as if nothing had happened. Georges asked her not to joke like that, but didn't understand what he meant. Georges explained that she had been sitting there, staring into space, not responding to his questions, and truly didn't remember any of it. Georges intended to call a doctor, but insisted she was fine. However, when the woman held a teapot, she almost dropped it because of the shaking of her hands. Later, Georges met their adult daughter Eva. She rarely visited her parents but came upon learning about the mother's illness. Georges admitted that Anne's operation hadn't gone well and doctors couldn't provide any prognosis. Georges believes he can manage it himself or else hire a caregiver. Workers brought a special bed for Anne into the apartment. Now the woman moves around in a wheelchair, as she has partially lost her ability to move. Georges is going to take care of his wife by himself. He is truly happy that she's back, and asked the husband to promise not to take her to the hospital anymore. Anne has always been afraid of hospitals and doesn't want to stay there anymore. Georges can't make such a promise, but his wife insists. In the evening, Georges helped Anne get into bed. She told the husband that he doesn't have to be constantly by her side, despite her declining health, and believes she can take care of herself in many ways. The concierge helps Georges by buying groceries. Otherwise, Georges takes care of his wife himself, including helping her with the bath. At night, Georges doesn't sleep, thinking about what lies ahead for him and Anne. Their happy life was instantly shattered by illness, but Georges is not ready to give up. The next morning at breakfast, Georges told the wife a story from his youth that he had never shared before, and asked why he hadn't shared it until today. Georges hinted that there's much she doesn't know about him. The couple laughed together. Georges began to gradually get used to the fact that he needed to care for his wife. He can't bear the thought of someone else doing it for him. Returning from the funeral of an old acquaintance, Georges found Anne sitting on the floor. She was disoriented and didn't know what time it was. Certainly, these memory lapses worry Georges. At his wife's request, Georges took her in the wheelchair to her room, and asked him to tell her about the funeral. Georges didn't think it was the right time to talk about it, but he eventually did. Pierre's funeral indeed went strangely. Hearing this, 80-year-old Anne said she no longer sees a reason to live. Most of all, she doesn't want to burden her husband. Georges said that taking care of her is not a burden at all. He knows that if Anne were in his place, she would do the same for him. But Anne didn't change her mind. At night, Anne couldn't sleep, barely holding back her emotions. The next day, Maestro Alexander Taro visited them. He wanted to personally see his former mentors. The couple was thrilled about his recent concert. Alexander Taro was immensely grateful to both Georges and Anne, who contributed to his success. From childhood, Alexander had a passion for music, and his endeavors had paid off. When Anne asked Alexander to play the piano for her, he couldn't refuse. Now, despite the difficulties, the couple is learning to find joy in the little things. However, Anne still feels sad at night. The concierge helps Georges with cleaning, but he is the sole caregiver for Anne. One day, Anne fell from the bed while attempting to get up. Georges was very scared for her, not understanding how she could be so reckless. He asked her to call him if she needed anything from then on. Late in the evening, the doorbell rang. Georges opened the door, but no one was there. Then Georges went into the hallway to check. The floor was flooded. Suddenly someone attacked him from behind. It turned out to be just a nightmare. The next morning, Georges told his wife that their daughter would soon come with Jeff, and said she didn't want to see Jeff, who would likely discuss her current condition. With the husband's help, Anne can stand and even take steps. But that doesn't mean she will recover. Soon, the couple received a tender letter from their former apprentice, Alexander Taro. For some reason this made Anne sad, and she no longer wants to listen to music recordings. During lunch, Anne asked her husband to bring the photo albums from the pantry. She wanted to look at it now. Georges fulfilled her request, and looked at the photos for a long time, reminiscing about the past. Their life was long but passed by swiftly. Before bed, Georges read articles from newspapers to his wife. This helped her fall asleep. In the morning, as always, Georges helped and get up. For the first time in her life, she wet the bed. It made him feel ashamed and resentful. Georges said there was nothing terrible about it. However, and still cried, feeling more helpless than ever before. She clearly didn't want to talk about what happened, intending to manage in the bathroom without the husband's help. However, Georges couldn't allow that. He would stay by his wife's side until the end. Their daughter Eva visited them, more interested in the family's estate than the mother's health, and can hardly speak anymore. Eva doesn't understand what her mother is trying to say. Gathering her strength, and began talking about a house she inherited from her grandmother. It sounded like incoherent rambling. Eva still didn't understand what her mother was trying to convey. Meanwhile, Georges talked with Jeff, the daughter's husband. Georges feels like he can't cope on his own, considering hiring a caregiver. Sometimes Anne is lucid, but at other times, she deteriorates. The conversation was interrupted by Eva, who came out of the mother's room in tears. Eva no longer recognizes her mother and believes she shouldn't be left here. Georges told his daughter that the doctors couldn't do anything for Anne, so leaving her in the hospital for examinations is pointless. However, Eva believes that the mother would be better off in a nursing home, where she would receive proper care. Jeff agrees with his wife, but Georges is vehemently against it because he made a promise to Anne. Starting from Monday, a caregiver will come to them 3 days a week. Georges was left alone with his problems. When the caregiver came, she showed him how to properly use diapers. Sometimes Anne pretended to play the piano. In reality, it was just a recording playing on a disc. Anne can no longer eat by herself, so the husband feeds her with a spoon. Anne's speech became unintelligible, as did her thoughts. She is no longer conscious of herself, saying delusional things. It's hard for Georges to watch the caregiver take care of Anne instead of him. Later, the caregiver explained that she and her colleague would come on alternate shifts. Before leaving, she said Anne's consciousness is far from here now. She might call for her mom or say other strange things, and Georges shouldn't pay attention to it. Georges holds the wife's hand, saying that he wants to hire a second caregiver. He truly can't manage alone. Many people who know the couple are very touched by the way Georges behaved in this position. However, it doesn't make it any easier for Georges. He often talks to Anne, hoping to trigger her memories in this manner. The rest of the time, one of the caregivers looks after Anne. Soon, Georges decided to dismiss the second caregiver due to her incompetence. The woman was indignant because she had been working for many years without any complaints. But Georges said he didn't owe her an explanation and paid her. When the woman left, Georges lit a cigarette. Taking care of his wife becomes increasingly challenging for him because Anne's condition is deteriorating. Additionally, Anne refuses water. Georges suspects that she is doing this intentionally because she is tired of living. Georges understands that if Anne continues in the same way, he will have no choice but to take her to the hospital. One day, the doorbell rang. Georges didn't expect the daughter to visit again. Before letting her in, Georges locked the door to the wife's bedroom. Eva was outraged because the father didn't answer any of her calls. The father simply said he didn't hear any calls. When Eva wanted to see her mother, the father wouldn't allow it. Georges made no secret of the fact that Anne looked like an unreasonable child and did not want anyone to see her like that. It's humiliating for both of them. Right now, Georges wants one thing, for the daughter not to interfere in their lives and not come unannounced. Georges is truly struggling, and the daughter's concern won't help him in any way. However, Eva insisted on seeing her mother. Georges eventually gave in, realizing that his daughter had a right to do so, and sleeps all day long. When Eva woke the mother, she didn't recognize her. This made Eva cry. Georges knew from the beginning it would be this way. He brought his daughter tea to calm her down. Eva asked her father what would happen next. The father found this question inappropriate because it's clear that things will only get worse. It will continue until it's all over. Eva still insists on a nursing home, believing her father won't be able to cope. Of course, these words did not sit well with Georges. Sometimes Anne's consciousness becomes somewhat clear. During these moments, Georges always talks to her and holds her hand. However, this usually doesn't last long, and often shouts, saying incoherent things. Georges distracts her with stories, hoping to alleviate his wife's plight in some way. Witnessing her suffering is unbearable for him. At one point, Georges couldn't bear it anymore, and taking a pillow, did what needed to be done. Georges took his wife's life because he saw no other way out. Afterward, Georges bought several bouquets of flowers and then took the most beautiful dress from the wife's closet. When everything was ready, Georges sealed the door. No outsider should enter here. Writing a letter to his wife, Georges caught a pigeon that flew into the apartment through the window. Then, Georges lay in bed for a long time, until he suddenly heard sounds. Georges went to check what was happening and saw Anne in the kitchen, washing dishes. She was just like before. Georges, who did not want to think about what was real and what was not, helped his wife put on her coat. After that, they left the apartment together, forever. After some time, Eva arrived. She was alarmed to find nobody at home. Eva remained in the parents' empty apartment,